Welcome to Central Bank Central. I'm Kathleen Hays. Well, the tension is building, at least to a certain extent. Tomorrow, Tuesday, will be the first day of the Fed's two-day policy meeting. And of course, on Wednesday, by 2 o'clock Eastern, we will know what the Fed has decided. Is it going to make the cut in rates that so many are expecting now? Let's get right to these questions. What's driving them, what the economy is doing, what inflation is signaling, with someone we always love to have here on Central Bank Central, and that is Dennis Lockhart, former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and in addition, Georgia Tech Distinguished Professor of the Practice at the Nunn School of International Affairs. So, Dennis, welcome back.
Thank you, Kathleen.
So, what do you think? It's a kind of a two-part question. Part one, is the Fed going to cut rates? And part two, if they do, what do you think of that decision?
Well, I think there will be a rate cut, but I do think it's a close call, and the case can be made for cutting, and the case can be made for a pause or a skip to let a little bit more data accumulate early in 2026. This may boil down to Chairman Powell counting noses and deciding between a picture to the markets and to the public of a committee that is not exactly in disarray, but a committee that really doesn't have a strong central consensus, or push forward to get a cut that I believe, on balance, he would prefer to execute at this meeting. I take a lot of signal from the speech by John Williams. And the reason I do is because, again, in my experience, there's a small circle, a leadership group that involves the chair, the president of the New York Fed, the vice chair, Jefferson, for monetary policy, possibly Governor Waller. Three or four people represent kind of the core of the committee, and I think they decide what position they would like the committee to take. And then it becomes a question of Jay Powell engaging with all the participants, typically the week before, but certainly the voters, just to see where he stands going into the meeting. So taking signal from John Williams' speech of a few weeks ago suggests to me that Chairman Powell would prefer a cut, and I think it'll be a close call, and there'll be dissents on both sides, but I think there will be a cut. Long-winded answer.
There you go. And of course, John Williams is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who is considered the third in line of command, starting with Jay Powell, as you just said, Fed chair, Philip Jefferson, the Fed vice chair, and John Williams. And John, uh, I saw him at least once giving a speech in the last few months, and he did seem much more on the balance, the middle, than he did
Mm-hmm.
in this latest speech. So this seems like a definite signal. I think that's how everyone's using it, right? And no matter what John Williams thinks, he may be, as you say, saying, well, I'm going to support the chair. This is what he wants. This is what I'm going to say.
We could be wrong about this. He did say in the speech a cut in the near future. He didn't say a cut in December.
True. Yes, very.
And, and it could be that he's expressing more of his own opinion. And Chair Powell says, well, I'll respect your opinion on this, and go ahead and give the speech. They typically are going to consult each other
Hmm.
before a major policy speech by John Williams. We could be overinterpreting, but that's
Okay.
my best indication of where they stand.
And I'm glad we put that on the table because I think that's what many people in the markets, people who follow the Fed, that's what everyone is kind of saying. Well, once I can't remember whose letter it was I read again this morning or something where someone said, yeah, well, John Williams' speech was a big signal for me, right? So that's a big factor in this widespread expectation. How about the data? Let's start with jobs data. Let's start with the labor market, because if you want to cut rates, that's your reason. Because inflation's still high. Some would even say rising. So on that side, what do you see in the last couple of months of data that we've gotten? We had jobless claims, you know, Might have been exaggerated by the Thanksgiving holiday, but it looks like layoffs are still very low.
Mhm.
There's some other numbers that suggest that there is some more hiring. And another argument that I've heard is that, hey, what if Trump does have to back off with the tariffs? That's going to maybe eliminate a source of pullback and uncertainty that's going to give another little boost to the economy. What do you see, Dennis?
Well, I think all those things are in play. It's a difficult economy to read, a difficult employment picture to read. You have indicators that suggest softness and maybe deterioration on one hand. I would say maybe the ADP report could be viewed that way. And other indicators that suggest steadiness. And you mentioned claims. I pay a lot of attention to initial claims just to get an indication in real time what's happening in employment markets and particularly layoffs. So I think the working assumption, which continues to be the case, is low firing, low hiring, um, gradually slowing labor market, but not collapsing, not falling off a cliff. Maybe could see an upspurt as well under certain circumstances. So there's a lot of ambiguity in my mind around the labor market at this stage. Does it justify a cut? My way of thinking is the Powell could couch it as the completion of an insurance package of three cuts. It's an insurance-oriented cut to build support under the labor market to the extent that monetary policy can do that, and then set it up as likely to justify a pause in January.
Let's look at the other side of the coin, and that is inflation. And I want to start with something you know, but let's share with everybody who's watching our conversation. At the Global Interdependence Center, which involves the College for Central Bankers, there was at least one person, but there were several mentions of price stability. That's, keeping inflation near its target and not rising as the number one thing that a central bank must do.
Mm-hmm.
And really the only thing it can do. The central bank can't really create jobs, but it can work on that. With inflation up around 3%, rounded off a little bit, and the target at 2%. Uh, what what is the Fed's thinking there for those who want to cut?
Well, I would expect that Powell will not indicate further cuts and that he may, to some extent, express a return to price stability as a priority in 2026.
Hmm.
And, or at least signal that the committee is serious about its price stability mandate, because I think we're in a very delicate time in which the world is beginning to doubt the credibility of the Fed as an inflation fighter, as a source of price stability in the U.S. economy. And the Fed is, for better or worse, the anchor institution in the world in monetary terms. So when the rest of the world begins to signal that we're not so sure you're committed to this particular target, I think they need to express their commitment. And so I think there may be language in the press conference that moves in that direction and suggests that they're not accepting 3% as an acceptable outcome in terms of inflation, and they're going to give attention to it in the coming months.
Well, I guess that puts all the emphasis on the dots, the Summary of Economic Projections, which is
Mhm.
the 19 members of the Federal Board Market Committee each have a forecast for growth, then inflation and unemployment, and from that they then each have a view on what level the Fed funds rate would be consistent with what I'm seeing for the economy. What are you expecting there?
Well, I'm going to pay attention to the range in the central tendency column, as opposed to the median necessarily, because I think the median can can be affected by just one or two dots on the extremes. You can move the media in one direction or the other. I think the range will tell you sort of how broadly the committee is thinking and give you a sense of how much contention there is among members of the committee, both participants and voting members. And although you can't tell from the dots who's a voting member and who's not, but
Mm-hmm.
so I'm going to pay attention to that range. And if it's a broader range, it tells me that there's just a variety of opinions at work that are going to influence the direction of policy next year, potentially. If it's a tighter range, then I think we can take real signal from that range in terms of near-term policy moves. Remember that the dots are at year end, so a lot can happen between now and year end. And I would say that the December dots that are projecting the next calendar year are far more speculative than the
Mm-hmm.
September dots that have 3/4 of the year behind you, or almost 3/4 of the year behind you, and are simply projecting where you're going to end up in December of that same year. So you can take far too much from the December dots, but it will give us some sense of the mindset of the committee.
Well, so if when you're talking about expectations, and of course the Fed's talking about anchored inflation expectations, which many people will dispute depending on which survey. Some surveys, New York Fed's seems more contained. If you look at the University of Michigan survey, you can see much more increase in what's expected. And Loretta Mester, former president of Cleveland Fed, pointed out to me lately that the Cleveland Fed has a business expectations index, which has shown
Mhm.
a fairly significant increase in what the people in that survey, business people, see from they did see inflation at 2%. That's what they thought was they could expect from the Fed. Now they think it's 2.5. So that's moving in a certain kind of a direction. So it seems to me it's got to be really hard. Even if Jay Powell seems to say, well, look, we're going to see what happens next year. If you have dots all over the map, if you have inflation still rising and the Fed still cutting rates, unless Powell comes out with something like, that's it, boy, really, we're almost done. Um, when there's already people in the markets looking for more rate cuts, at least a couple more next year, it's going to be a very difficult message to get forward powerfully, I would think.
Yeah, I think another complicating factor is that Powell leaves the scene in May. So it's very hard for him in any period to commit the committee. He cannot do that.
Mhm.
But certainly to the extent that he can commit a certain leadership message, he can't even commit that now. He's leaving the scene at
Oh,
mid-year.
yeah.
And we don't know who's going to follow him and what that new chair is likely to push and how many people will follow. So it's a very it's a very um, rattled time, I think, to
Yeah.
take signal from these dots or even some of the spoken messages.
Well, okay, so you brought up the question that's big here on this list as well, and that is Fed independence. There's the decision known as Humphrey's executor that's going to look at the president's ability to fire members of the SEC and other regulatory agencies. It's a question of how the Fed Reserve might be, held to that or part of that, right? And of course, there's still the pending case of Lisa Cook, a Fed governor who has managed to hang in against a big push to get her out by the White House. So are you any more worried about Fed independence, or is it something we're just
Mm.
kind of all getting used to now? Wait and see what happens?
Well, I think you have to worry about it given the current environment, the political environment, and the number of efforts made to change the um, both the governors as a group, but also change the way things are done. So you have to worry about it. Much will depend on how the new chair conducts himself or herself once in office, and to what extent the ethos of central bank independence is taken on board by the new chair, and some distance conceivably between the new chair and the White House. I mean, this
Yeah,
could very well happen. We in a year we may be looking back and saying, it was much ado about nothing, actually, but you can't tell. Also, the decisions of the Supreme Court are going to be monumental in how much independence central bank will enjoy.
yeah.
I
Well,
think you
I
can
have to.
boil this down, Kathleen. I think you can boil this down as long-term interest rates are in play.
Oh boy, well, and some people are already getting very worried about bond yields, and they've been pretty holding steady to a certain extent, but that it may not be too long before we see the long end rising, even if there's ways to keep the short end lower. But
Mhm.
uh, the 12 district bank president system, for the Federal Reserve. I've always thought that, and I still think this is my personal view, that the Fed bank presidents are very important. This is one of the things that was very important when the Federal Reserve was set up, not to make it just a Washington-based, federal government-based organization, but something that represents people across the country. And that seems, from what we've heard from Scott Bessent, and others, that maybe that's not viewed by them the same way. Do you think it's something that needs to be changed? And especially a very specific one, since I mentioned Treasury Secretary Bessent, the idea that Fed Bank president nominees should have lived at least 3 years in their district. That's a specific question of 3 years, I should say. That I can ask you. But broadly speaking, the big picture with district bank presidents who can speak, who can vote, not even, and this idea, no, that we've got to be stricter, and the idea that maybe there's the new a board with new governors, they're not going to reappoint the 12 district bank presidents that are already there. And that's always just been something you do as a matter of course.
Mhm. Well, let's break this down. At the end of February, there will be a reappointment of some or all of the Fed presidents. When I was there, it was a perfunctory vote, and the whole thing took 5 minutes. Now, apparently, it's going to be more, more thorough discussion, and conceivable that some presidents may not be reappointed. I think that's possible for various reasons. Um, I do think the risk of a wholesale firing of all the Reserve Bank presidents now is probably past. But I do think those who would like to have more control over monetary policy and more political control can see the importance of having some influence on the appointment of Reserve Bank presidents. And that process is seems to be a little bit in play. There's just one article I picked up on that suggested that the White House is going to try to enforce a 3 years in the district residence rule.
Hmm.
Not clear to me whether that's 3 years in your lifetime or 3 years in the last five
Yeah.
years or
Uh-huh.
last 10 years. So that's not clear. And that may not be the end of the world. I mean, I do think presidents need to reflect to some extent the environments that they're representing, and have a rapport with Main Street in their districts. And in my experience, all have had that kind of rapport. They've worked well with the business community and are able to pull out of conversations very useful information. So it's not necessarily a rule that it is going to completely change the way things are done. My concern, Kathleen, would be unqualified Fed presidents who don't contribute anything at the table where policy's made,
In
and
other words,
for that matter, may detract from the credibility of policy. That would be my concern.
so in terms of the next Fed chair, what there's a number of names on the table. Kevin Hassett is widely viewed as the person to be the ultimate pick. Although we know Donald Trump, you never know what he's really going to do at the end, right? And Kevin Hassett, a loyalist to Fed, very clearly excuse me, to the president. Uh, do you have anything you'd like to say about him, about this process, about what is your concern about who might get picked, who will not hold up the duties, let's start with price stability of the Fed, the way people have at least tried to do it in the past?
Well, all the candidates who've been mentioned and have been listed in the press are credible candidates, in my opinion. They're all qualified, and they will all, in all likelihood, do a perfectly fine job. The one thing that has concerned me for months is, what do you have to say in that final interview in order to be the nominee? To what extent is that conversation a loyalty test? And to what extent do you commit to lower interest rates, which in fact the chair cannot really do? The chair has to bring along the committee. I would hate to see someone nominated and confirmed who then was really being torn apart by the reality of the committee structure and how it works versus the pressures that come from outside. That would be a very uncomfortable position for a new chair to be in. Tough thing to navigate, lots of confusion in the markets, lots of potential volatility, which as the world tries to read, what kind of chair is this going to be? And credibility as regards the inflation side of the mandate will be connected to how that drama plays out. So that's my concern.
Well, I think it's a concern that a lot of people share. There's still a lot of speculation. In fact, actually, Dennis, I think there's growing speculation that depending on how the next couple of months play out, that Chair Powell, Jay Powell, two-term Fed chair, may actually consider seriously staying around. The way this works, his 4 years as governor, second term as governor will be up, but he'll still be eligible to be on the board of governors for another couple of years. I think many people in the past said, oh no, he wouldn't bother, he won't do that. But there's more and more people wondering if he might actually do that. If he too is concerned about who gets the replacement job behind him and what the signals are there, and if it might help protect this the Fed as it traditionally has worked, if he stays around longer and doesn't let at least one more governor be appointed by the president.
I still doubt that he will do that. I think he will be part of his thinking would have to be, I want the new chair, regardless of affiliation, to have the best chance to be successful and to lead the committee. And if I were in Jay Powell's shoes, I'd be thinking, if I stay around, they're going to be paying attention to my voice. They being the press and others, are going to potentially see a divided committee that is more divided than the reality. And they're going to feed that fire to some extent with articles, a very negative dynamic. It's the equivalent of private sector companies where the chair stays around, the CEO stays around as chair and looks over the shoulder of the new CEO. Not a healthy situation, and I don't think Powell will want to play that role.
Well, Dennis, gotta leave it there because that's the best summation. That's the best argument I have heard so far for Jay Powell just saying, look, no matter what happens, I've done what I can do. My successor, whoever it is, has to carry it all forward. So thank you for that, and so much more.
My pleasure always.
Well, and that's of course Dennis Lockhart. He's former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He's also Georgia Tech Distinguished Professor of the Practice, the Nunn School of International Affairs. Man who brings a lot to the table whenever he comes to Central Bank Central. I'm Kathleen Hays, and yeah, so glad you joined us here today on Central Bank Central.